Thomas Green here on the Peaceful Parenting podcast. On the episode today, we have Lainie Liberti. Lainie, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It is my pleasure. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Well, I am a parent first and foremost, and I am a single parent who raised her son pretty much traveling the world. So we left the United States where we're originally from in 2009, and we were going to travel for a 1 year trip. And Well, that was almost 15 years ago. A year into our travels, we decided to just continue it. And along the way, so many things changed and we discovered and really stepped into partnership parenting, unschooling or self-directed learning while traveling, which we called world schooling. And that included a multi-age learning. So we learned in partnership. We also, created a very strong family culture because as two people who used to live a conventional life, we then had to renegotiate how we connected and how we functioned and managed our time and our relationship. And that really took us down the path of discovering and exploring mental health, accountability, partnership, living without rules instead of, having an authority over both of us, or me being the authority in the relationship. Partnership was what we adapted. And the way that we managed to live without rules was by tuning in and tapping into our core values and using that as a way to determine, what answers we would like to give to certain questions. Like, here's an invitation. Would you like to go here? Well, is that in alignment with our core values? And that helped us to really navigate our lives without external rules, but living really in alignment with the core values that individually each of us had, and then collectively as our family culture. So there's a lot to unpack here. Having two people step out of a very conventional paradigm meant that number one, we had to reinvent our scaffolding that made us feel safe and gave, a sense to our travels. And also really addressing the education stuff together and going with that kind of flow. It required deschooling from my perspective. It required really empowerment through curiosity from the perspective of my child. And it also required a lot of negotiation and collaboration and cooperation. And those were muscles that were really exercised and built during these 12, 13, 14 years on the road together.
Thank you for the introduction. There was one thing I was going to ask you about, and you mentioned it in your introduction, which was the term partnership parenting. It's if I had to guess, I would assume it's sort of similar to peaceful parenting. But what definition do you share with in terms of the term partnership parenting?
Well, so I am truly an autodidactic, and I have been my entire life. I, I had and I'm going to answer your question, I promise you. I had quite a traumatic childhood, and part of my trauma response was hyperindependence, which served me in really many respects, but in some respects, from an interpersonal relationship perspective, I had to really unpack and pull apart those things and heal it. But what it did give me was the power that I understood that I had a brain that I was carrying around with me. And I really felt empowered to use it. And so becoming a very passionate, self-directed learner myself throughout my entire life gave me that permission or awareness to dive deep in any topic. Now, that being said, I always knew I wanted to be a parent, and I always wanted to parent in a way which was radically different than the way that I was parented. So the only thing that I knew about parenting was I didn't want to do it the same way. And so that drove me before I became a parent. And while I, was early in my parenting stage, to dive deep into all of these different modalities. So I read books on conscious parenting and peaceful parenting, as you mentioned, collaborative parenting, and boy, hand in hand parenting, aware parenting. There are so many different modalities and attachment parenting. And I took the best of the best from all of these different types or philosophies behind parenting because, again, I was so self-educated. Can't say I'm an expert in anything, but I really dived deep into this whole research. And what I found, there was a common theme between most of these modalities of parenting. And that was really connection-based parenting based on, in most cases, nonviolent communication, peaceful connection. But what I did find between the lines was there was still, in many of these modalities, still a fundamental nature of manipulating your child's behavior so that you had either a peaceful home or a gentle home or, a hand-in-hand home. And a lot of these had great strategies and techniques and philosophies behind it. But that manipulation part really got to me. And even if it meant changing the behavior or acting in a certain way to change the behavior of your child so that you have, greater connection, greater peace. But the changing the behavior part was the thing that got under my skin because I did find that as an agenda. I found that as a manipulation. So in order to bypass that, we created a partnership, and I wanted many of the same things. I wanted connection-based, parenting. I wanted attachment. I want, secure attachment. I wanted to have peace, and, I wanted our connection to be gentle and all of those different things. But I didn't want to have to take the leader role to change my child's behavior because God knows I did not have the foundation of being raised with, having that as an example. So I didn't want to be the person who was in the lead. And in fact, from a young age in my, adolescence and, childhood, all the way through to my young adulthood, even to today, I self-identified politically as an anarchist. And what that gave me is not anarchy from the perspective of chaos or creating mayhem in environments. Basically, the classic definition of anarchy is not giving authority to other people or systems or institutions without consent. So it was really about consensual based connection with my own life. And that meant that I had to be accountable for not only my reactions, knowing what my inner worlds were, but it also meant that I was accountable for my own triggers and my emotional states and the connection and communication. I was not going to give that power away to a system or an institution and so forth. And in my parenting, I wanted it to be hand in hand or partnership based because I did not want to play the role of the rule maker, the rule enforcer, and then the punisher when the rules were not kept. And even though it's much simpler in a parenting paradigm to have one person to be the authority. I didn't want to play that role. And so in order to live in partnership, I had to model and facilitate accountability, emotional accountability in that of my child. And I also had to nurture a very, very deep connection. And in order not to have rules which are outside of ourselves, we use the values-based system. So we're accountable for the self-inquiry. Is this decision in alignment with our core values? If yes, it's us giving consent instead of just blindly following the authority. And that clearly meant, in my mind, not becoming the authority of my child, but becoming the partner. So partnership parenting became the best way to describe what we were doing. But like I said, it was taking the best of all of these different modalities and using it in such a way that it allowed us both to walk side by side, literally, in the world.
Thank you for the answer, and certainly sounds like something I would say preferable to most parent-child relationships. I did notice in your, I think it's the media kit, you have coached over 100 teens. Is that correct?
Actually, I need to update that. It's probably double now. But yes.
200 teens. Thank you for the
Yeah.
correction. My question is around, often if you sort of interact with certain groups of people, there are some themes that you learn or some commonalities around, shall we say, characteristics or traits. What have you learned from coaching 200 teens?
Well, first of all, I mean, I wrote a book and I know we're going to talk about that, but the third chapter of my book is all about pulling apart, dispelling the common cultural teen myths. And a lot of times adults forget about their own adolescent journey. And a lot of times adults that just consent or adhere to this authoritarian based paradigm in their lives. They just give their power and just fall, put their heads down, consent, follow systems, also step into an authoritarian based, authority over their teens. And so it's already not conducive of greater connections. And so what I've found with teens primarily is they're looking to be seen, heard, and understood, which of course happens to be the title of my book. But seen, heard, and understood has these deep facets to it. It means connecting in a partnership way, which is what I do with teens, but connecting in such a way where it's really allowing them to be seen and heard and valuing their opinions. I've been hosting for the last 3.5 years since COVID started, but I've been working with teens for 10 years plus, but online since the 3.5 years. Been holding space for teens twice a week for 3.5 years. I've been hosting 2 weekly meetups for teens, and these are free to any teen in our community, just any teen in the world, right? And I have teens from around the world because, again, world schooling is something that I'm quite known for. And I started, my son and I created community around that. So I've got, 40, 50,000 people that are a part of our community. And reaching out to them saying, okay, guys, as world schoolers, we're not traveling. I'm holding safe space for teens. And I know they're struggling the most. And what I discovered during the pandemic mostly, which is, a more sort of trauma-based connection, is teens oftentimes in the pandemic and before and after feel as if their voice doesn't matter. And they feel as if the adults in their lives don't care to ask their deepest, darkest, most creative thoughts about the world or about life or about themselves. And so I started to engage with them on topics surrounding self inquiry and self help and self development and philosophy. And time and time again, teens tell me, nobody's ever asked my opinion about philosophy before. Nobody's asked me to think and feel and poke around and see what my belief system is. They just expect for me to answer and say yes and be quiet when it's my time to be quiet. And that is really heartbreaking because my entire childhood and adolescence, I felt like I was invisible. And the constant, internalization of feeling dismissed does have major effects on a person's mental health. And for me, my journey took me into a self-empowerment place by seeking out tools to really understand, dive deep, pull apart what was happening in my internal worlds. And the tools that I started to use after that was to reprogram my way that I saw the world. But I had to be able to access that first. And empowering teens in such an empowering way, a connecting way, without judgment, without an agenda, basically, and allowing them to be exactly who they are and celebrating exactly who they are, without a predetermined judgment, which unfortunately, and I am a parent and I assume you are too, we cannot as parents easily get rid of our sort of collective opinion of our child because we've been with them their whole lives. And so we have this collective idea of who we think they are, which during adolescence is almost contrary to the stage that they are entering. They're entering a stage of exploring identities and letting go of what they didn't like about themselves and moving into different spaces and different ways of exploring and becoming self. But as parents, we see the collective, well, you've always been lazy, but that doesn't leave a whole lot of space for them to change from an intrinsically motivated space. And we don't, as parents, do this intentionally. We just happen to know this human being that we've been entrusted with, and we do, without even thinking, have an opinion of them. So to have an adult, and again, parents are great. I'm a parent, but we have our own stuff to work out. And if we're aware that this is one of the things that stifles our adolescent when they're moving into this fully dynamic, exciting time in their life, in some respects, as parents, we're holding them back from really stepping into their own power. So as an adult, working with teens in a partnership way, which is how I raised my son, right? That becomes really affirming, life affirming to them. And so I love being that person. I love partnering with them. I've got a really wonderful spirit and means to connect with the teens. Part of that is because, a good part of the trauma that I experienced was in my own adolescence. And I can easily connect with my inner child or inner adolescent who was so, so sad and so, not seen and really felt invisible, that her voice comes out when I connect with the teens. And every time I connect with a teen, it's as if I'm healing a part of my inner teen. And it's so lovely.
Thank you for sharing that. You
Yeah.
mentioned the book is Seen, Heard, and Understood.
Mm.
My question is around seen and heard. I kind of feel is easy, at least for me, to understand in the sense that they're not being acknowledged, and when they do speak, people aren't listening to them. The third part, perhaps the understood part, I feel like my perception is that people struggle with understanding some behaviors of teens. So, what would you share on the understanding teens perspective?
Sure. So, I mean, this can go many ways. So let's just witness this come out of my mouth. Um, Understanding teens. I'm going to approach this first from a neurobiological perspective. And I'm going to first talk about the adults. So, as adults, yes, we do have neuroplasticity. And for those of your audience that are not sure what that means, it means we have the ability to create new neural pathways, which is the way that we think about certain things. And we have the ability to expand, adjust, and create basically new ways of approaching our life. But we have way less neuroplasticity than a child, and specifically an adolescent. And in our culture, the majority of adults at the age of 25 and just beyond, we sort of give up the pursuit of expanding our awareness of ourselves, of how the world works. And we pretty much cement that because we don't start creating new ways of thinking about that. I'm not saying every adult, and I'm not saying, that it's dire and we can't change this as a culture. But when you're talking to an adult who has a very rigid way of thinking about the world and about parenting and about children and about themselves, it's hard to expand and modify our belief system, but not impossible. On the other hand, teens are going through this really dynamic time where they're, like I said, they're trying on new identities. There's more hypervigilance in teens, which means when they've got an idea and that really resonates with them on one level or another, they become pretty focused on that. And idealism in adolescence is really a powerful trait of that time of development. And somehow that is in contrast to the stage that parents are in. And especially in the modern world, parents who, again, they're focused on work, life, whatever that balance is, work, parenting balance. And there's usually a lot of stress. And so the focus of the parent is really sort of linear path, where teens are, trying on new identities, and their idealism sometimes maybe be in conflict with the perception or philosophy of the adult. And that puts them sometimes in contrast with one another. And I think there is a neurobiological reason why teens don't feel understood. It's because, from a biological perspective, the developmental stages of both are very, very different. And I can already hear somebody in your audience saying, yeah, but my 3-year-old has a different biological developmental stage, and I can still connect with them. And the difference is when they're from 0 to 7, and even up until the tween ages, they are still, from a developmental stage, very, very dependent. But adolescence, from a psychological evolutionary perspective, adolescence is designed to help young people individuate, step into their own identities, which is separate from the family unit. And that can be in contrast to the convenience of the parent, right? Because their heads are down and they're busy in their schedules, their work, their parenting, work life balance, and all the craziness on the planet means that, adjusting to a new way of connecting with a young person is inconvenient for many, many parents, which is why the myths around adolescence is so strong in today's culture. And I'm sure if I challenged you or your audience to list off 10 myths about teens, it'd be really easy to rattle those off. Some of them may include things like teens are impulsive, teens are lazy, teens are rude, and all of these different myths that we accept as adults as truth means the lens that we're looking at our teens through now is tainted, and we have a hard time seeing them for exactly where they are. Instead, we're looking at them through the lens. So many times, adolescents, teens feel misunderstood, and it takes work to understand not only what they're thinking, but understanding about human development from a psychological, neurobiological, chemical perspective, taking all that into consideration as a parent and being compassionate and open. And that takes more work than, using the iron fist and the hammer and saying, here are the rules, follow them, and not taking the time to connect.
Thank you for the answer. My attempt at a summary of it, if you would say whether it's accurate or not, is the teens are sort of testing out their ways of thinking and their, as you said, identities, whereas older adults have already done that and are more of a fixed way of thinking, and so there is a bit jarring or a bit of a conflict there. Would you say that's an okay summary of your answer?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually use the model from, I think her name is Carol Dweck, where she talks about fixed mindset versus growth mindset. And I use that as an analogy in my book. But you're pretty accurate with your summary.
Thank you for that. I'm glad I took something accurate from it anyway. But I did want to ask you about the perhaps the should we say the psychology part of the teen journey. And what I mean by that is some people, for example, this might be one of your misconceptions around teens acting out, for example. Are there any behaviors that perhaps are common among teens, which parents could prepare for, or that they know it's coming? Essentially, have you covered any of that?
A lot of that is in my book, but here's going to be the most jarring out of all the different sections. And I've got a whole chapter on red flags and things to do. But what I'm going to present is accurate for about 95% of the teens in culture today.
It's a good one then, basically, is what you're saying.
It's a good one. Let's talk about drugs, right? There are, according to Dr. Daniel Siegel, who is a psychologist who is an expert in attachment theory, and he wrote a really powerful book called Brainstorm, the Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain. He outlined I think it's three. As soon as I speak, I'll know it's three or four. But the different means in which teens will approach, like narcotics, drinking, drugs, that sort of thing. It's four. The first stage, which almost every adolescent in modern culture will be confronted with, is experimentation. And before I go into these, I just want to premise this with partnership parenting and many of these different modalities, connection is the key, and remaining connected to your adolescent, to your teen during this stage of development is so important, because they need to have that, what's at the end of the tether is getting stretched farther and farther as they start to explore their independence. But if they feel that they can come back and reconnect in this safe space with their parents, with their, mom or dad or both, it really allows them to come back and recuperate and reconnect. But if that tether is broken, then it may propel them into deeper stages of the drug experience. So the first stage really is experimentation, which in many respects can be healthy. Now, like record scratch here, I am not advocating for kids to go out and do drugs, but I am advocating for them to feel confident in their ability to say yes or to say no, and to know what feels safe for them, and to be able to recoil, go back to their safe spaces, which is with their family, and pull that stuff apart and unpack it together. And hopefully it never goes farther than experimentation. But after experimentation, the next stage is this. And experimentation has a social element, but the next stage is using drugs, narcotics, alcohol to numb. And there are 3 stages. And to numb, that's already getting into a danger area. That means other parts of their lives are, problematic, and they need to have the support to be able to pull that apart and really process that. Because if you go into the last stage, which is addiction, that's where obviously teens need some big support, and it can be in the form of an institution, but addiction is very, very dangerous. And I think if within families there is good communication and strong connection, you can have some of these tough conversations. I know that I don't know about the UK, but in the United States, marijuana, cannabis use is legalized in most states now. And so from a social perspective, it's widely accepted. And I grew up in a household of hippies, but I never became a pot smoker, only because I always smelled it growing up. But I wish back then there was more information about how cannabis or marijuana affects the teenage brain in terms of development. And it is a dangerous substance to use while your brain is developing. And I'm not anti or pro, but I'm saying if parents were equipped with this information, they would be able, in a non-coercive way, share this information with their teens. And I'm not advocating for using any particular substance, but when our teens are faced with making a decision in a social circumstance, at least they'll have the information. Brain development, they may or may not find that important, but if you as a parent fully understand what the stages of development are and how it plays out from a neurobiological and even hormonal perspective, you'll be able to share that in a non-coercive way with your teen and say, hey, let's just look at what happens to the brain. I'm not saying don't do this. I'm saying understand if you make this choice 1 or 2 times, okay, maybe you want to experience or experiment. But understand if it goes beyond experimentation into habitual use, it's absolutely detrimental to your own development.
Thank you very much for sharing that. You did give me a segue, so I appreciate that. My co-host who is often on these episodes, has a couple of teens, and he asked me to ask you a particular question. So it's very
Yeah.
specific, but I
Okay.
would like to know what your thoughts are. And it is that one of his teens is struggling with concentration. So she says that she gets bored really easily and finds herself being distracted all the time in class. So I know it's very specific, and I'm putting you on the spot a bit, but I'd just like to know what your thoughts are.
Well, as a parent and an advocate for getting your kids out of school, um, I'm really tapped into the empowerment aspect of learning. And that can only come from intrinsic motivation. So the first thing I would ask your co-host is your child enjoying school? Are they intrinsically motivated to learn? Is the Well, when you put a child into a rewards and punishment system, really they're performing to grab the carrot, and concentration is, and I'm gonna touch on executive functioning in just a second, because that's a part of it too. But concentration, you can't hide that. You can't fake that. You could pretend that you're interested in focusing. And if you're doing it out of fear of being punished, that's going to create a nervous energy and a nervous relationship to whatever it is that they need to be doing to perform in a way that's expected of them. And I think the moment that you remove a child from that kind of paradigm and create a more self-actualized paradigm for them to learn in, you'll find that the concentration issues leave. They're gone because they're studying and focused on what they wish to. And the intrinsic motivation will keep them engaged. Now, the other respect is, again, I'll get back to executive functioning, but each one of us, every human being has a different learning style. Some of us really are activated in our body through movement, and we require movement while we're learning. Some of us are auditory learners, some of us are visual, and some of us love to read, right? And some of us have, different aspects in all of those to some degree. So finding the way that your child learns the most, are they a kinesthetic learner? Are they an auditory learner? And adjusting, if possible, right, the manner in which they engage with the material may help their quote unquote concentration. But if they're not interested and they're just performing because of rewards and punishment, then you're not going to get a change in that. And there's great books around that. I'm blanking on his name right now. I could picture his face. I used to do podcasts and I interviewed him. Alfie Kohn, that's his name. So he's got a series of wonderful books around learning school. There's even one called Punishment by Rewards, which talks about the carrot and the stick in terms of learning. So, I urge your audience and your co-host to take a look at his work if he hasn't already. And then the last point is, from a biological developmental perspective, executive functioning doesn't develop until they're really out of their adolescence. We can do things to start to train that, but from a natural perspective, executive function, what that actually means for your audience who may not understand what that means, is the ability to manage our time, to understand big picture, and to be able to run multiple tasks, not at the same time, but close to one another. Most of it has to do with concentration and time management, but also integrating all of the things that each team or person needs to do. And from the perspective of brain development, they're not going to be able to fully manage that until they're in their mid-20s. And so the expectation that adults have on our young learners may not be in alignment with where they are from a developmental stage. And I think it's up to us as parents to understand that. The school system is a system, I believe, of control. And that is not really supporting learning. It just doesn't. I'm not a fan of institutional learning. I'm a fan of self-directed learning or learning in partnership. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I think there's definitely some good stuff in there, but
Okay.
I appreciate your the perspective you're coming from. You're not a big fan of school, so I kind of get it.
Yeah.
Just coming back to your book, congratulations for becoming an author, by the way. You got a favorite chapter?
Well, I think it's got to be the chapter of tools. The entire book, it's sort of a progression. There's tools throughout the book. There's a lot of science and research and philosophy and psychology and biology, and it's written in such a way. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a PhD in any of this stuff. What I am is a person with a brain who loves to research and parse information and use it, and that has always been a part of my experience through life. And I think the way that I tell stories from my childhood and how that, turned into some big challenges and how I approached, addressing those challenges of reprogramming my belief system and the pattern thinking and so forth. I think the book as a whole is really approachable because it has all of these really strong concepts and storytelling. But again, to answer your question, my favorite chapter has got to be the tools. And there are actual workbook type tools in there where I invite parents to do the work themselves. Use the tool, understand, use self-inquiry to pull apart and see what's there and what needs to still be healed and where the triggers are coming from and what those belief systems are. And even take a look at where they came from and how they've played out in your life, either to the benefit of your experience or sometimes to the detriment. And that kind of understanding is really empowering. And then the challenge from the book is to facilitate the same tools with your teen by first sharing what you discovered about yourself. You see, one of the powerful paths to connection is through vulnerability. And most parents just automatically believe I gave birth to this child or I adopted this child, or it's a blended family, but they should respect and love me without the act of connecting, the intentionality to connect. And vulnerability and love, of course, are two very strong ways. But a lot of times parents believe the assumption is love is enough, and that just because I gave birth or I am the parent to this child, they should love me. And that's not enough. Vulnerability and intentionality really is the foundation of connection. And I'm hoping that parents that read the book and use the tools and then use the tools to facilitate with their children with the authenticity of sharing what they discovered about themselves will help to inspire and connect with their teens who are really looking for connection in this stage, but they're doing it through a giant brick wall. So as the adult, you need to be able to gently move the wall brick by brick and do that through strength and passion and purpose.
Great answer. Thank you for that. And for people who do want to buy the book, where do they go?
So my book at this point is only available on Amazon, but it's available in every country. I've got a digital version. I've got a softback version. And then a year after my book was published, we published an anniversary edition, which is a hardcover edition. It's a little bit more money, but there are 6 extra tools in there and a gift for anybody who purchases the hardcover version, which is a free consultation with me for an hour. So anytime you're reading the book and you're finding that you're getting stuck or there are specific issues, make an appointment and I'll jump on and help you unpack that. I also have the audio version being recorded now. So cross your fingers with me. It'll be available by the end of the year.
So maybe an Audible somewhere
Yeah.
then, is that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
hopefully by the end of the year. But you can access all that through Amazon in your country.
Lainie, thank you for the value today, and thanks for being a great podcast guest.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the great work you're doing for this community.